thank you all for having me here. Thanks to Leslie, thanks to the board members, Brian Kuhn, a good friend of mine. This is my first time attending Flash, but I've really heard about it so many times. I've been intrigued, and I got to say that it's lived up to expectations after hearing all the presentations this morning. Now, as a founding partner of Flash, FEMA has been very involved over the years. We've been definitely on board with bringing awareness to building codes, to making sure that we're getting the word out to businesses through the Ready Business workshops, and even our smallest citizens with the storm-struck weather experience at Disney Epcot. Now, the mission of Flash is to strengthen homes and property to save lives, and that's never been more important than right now. In the last 2 years, we've seen incredible disasters, and with the frequency and growing intensity of these storms and the impacts that we're seeing, we need to remember to build back, not just the same as we did before, but to build back stronger and better. Now, 2017 was a very busy year for our field of emergency management. We didn't really get a breather in 2018 either, did we? Now, many of you know, and many of you have been on the ground and seen the impacts, and all those presentations have really provided tremendous insights to all of us in this broader community to understand and learn from these disasters so that we can do it, whether it be the response phase, the recovery phase, or something that is near and dear to all of our hearts, which is mitigation. Now, early estimates from Hurricane Florence go up to $50 billion, and given some of these scary statistics, like the fact that only 3% of North Carolinians had flood insurance, see that we lack a true culture of preparedness in this nation. We've been very blunt at FEMA about the need for a culture of preparedness. You've heard my boss, Brock Long, probably speak about this. And speaking truth to power and saying that it's not acceptable for building codes to be lax or not enforced. It's not acceptable for individuals to not have insurance. We need the American public to understand the value of this. Now, FEMA's recently gotten some tools to help us in this mission, and very specifically, the Disaster Reform and Recovery Act of 2018 recently passed. I know that you heard something about that yesterday, and I just want to hit the high points here because it really is a transformational change in the way FEMA does business. It involves greater investment in mitigation, and specifically, investment in mitigation up front. Now, as all of you, I think, know, counterintuitively, most of FEMA's mitigation money is spent only after the disaster. Our hazard mitigation grant program is very large and billions of dollars, but it's only for those communities that have already been hit. Our pre-disaster program, meanwhile, has been relatively small, not billions, but hundreds of millions, and inconsistent. Our pre-disaster mitigation programs historically have depended on Congress, on congressional appropriations, and the appropriation has varied in the hundreds of millions of dollars each year. Well, no longer. Now, with the pre-disaster mitigation program authorized through DRRA, through that act, we now have 6% of eligible disaster expenses available up front, available to any community prior to a disaster. Now, the exact contours of that program are currently under development. The onus is on me and my staff to come up with a program that's going to make a huge difference. The administrator's guidance to us is he doesn't want a bunch of one-offs. He doesn't want a structure strengthened here or there. He wants this to be a true transformational piece of legislation that it was intended to be. And that means reducing risk across the board with a comprehensive pre-disaster mitigation program. Now, DRRA isn't just PDM. That's near and dear to my heart. But it's also a few other areas. For example, it authorizes and makes permanent mitigation for areas that have been hit by wildfires. Those areas that have been issued a FMAG, Fire Management Assistance Grant, now have the opportunity to invest in mitigation to reduce those impacts, like Roy Wright told that very personal story about the wildfires in Northern California right now. Now, we also need to increase the state capacity to manage disaster recovery. And one of the ways the DRRA will help us do that is increasing the administrative cost share, increasing the amount of administrative costs allowable for disaster recovery. That's up to 12% for implementing public assistance and up to 15% for hazard mitigation projects. There's a statistic here that I think often surprises people, which is that there are at least 17 federal departments and agencies that are involved in disaster recovery. Those 17 federal departments and agencies have over 200 recovery programs. We at FEMA need to lead the way and reduce the complexity of all these programs, and in fact, that's one of our strategic goals. So goal number 3 of our strategic plan is reduce the complexity of FEMA programs. I'll give you some examples here in a minute. Going backwards, goal number 2 is increasing the catastrophic readiness for these major disasters we're seeing. And number 1, the one I'm going to spend the most time on, is fostering a culture of preparedness. Now, I lead goal number 1 for FEMA. It is my charge from the administrator and from the secretary, from the President of the United States, who cares about reducing the impact of future disasters. Now, to do so, we've taken this to heart, this goal, so much so that we've reorganized FEMA around this. And I'm not up here to bore you with government reorganizations, but I will say is we have reorganized around mission. So we now have an organization called FEMA Resilience that I lead. And as Ed mentioned, that includes mitigation, insurance, preparedness, continuity, and all of our grant programs. And in total, that's about 3,000 federal employees dedicated to resilience, and billions of dollars of grant money available to state and local communities to build their resilience. Now, within the culture of preparedness, we have 4 objectives. If you have really good eyesight, you can probably read it on the screen there. Number 1 is mitigation. Obviously, a key pillar to building a culture of preparedness is to invest in mitigation now. That's going to reduce the risk to people, to property, and to taxpayer dollars. And developing resilient communities ahead of a disaster reduces loss of life and economic disruption. Now, working closely with our partners in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, we have funded a $10 million code adoption project to bring them up to the 2018 building codes. And building codes are only as good as the enforcement, so we've allocated an additional $79 million in a code enforcement project that will fund up to 273 personnel, including building inspectors, in Puerto Rico. Now, importantly, these investments impact all infrastructure and all construction in Puerto Rico, not just those that are federally funded. And it'll ensure that recovery builds back a permanent and resilient infrastructure. A lot of this mitigation activity in Washington is synced up through our National Mitigation Investment Strategy. It's an alignment of all these federal agencies' mitigation programs. And why this is, of course, important to all of us is what we've heard over and over again. That National Institute of Building Sciences study on the $1 invested returns $6 in costs avoided when a disaster happens. What I do is I travel around the country and I try to inspire those from outside of our community, from outside of the experts that are sitting here, and explain to them that mitigation really does save money and it saves lives. Now, would you believe that we have very specific examples of how mitigation has saved lives? I think we might have actually heard some here today. But let me give you one from back in 2001 with Tropical Storm Allison. Texas Medical Center was damaged as a result of that tropical storm, and as a result, they got hazard mitigation money from FEMA. Now, they invested that money wisely, and as a result, Texas Medical Center stayed open and operating, caring for disaster survivors during Hurricane Harvey. Mitigation saves lives. Another core element to fostering a culture of preparedness is insurance. You might be surprised to learn that currently the United States has the largest insurance gap in the world. Insurance gap is the difference, as our colleagues from USAA and State Farm know, it's the difference between what's insured and what's insurable. That gap is huge. Again, in the U.S., it's the largest gap. According to global reinsurer Swiss Re, the average expected losses from natural disasters in any given year in the United States is about $55 billion. Of that $55 billion in potential losses, $30 billion is uninsured. So let me say that a different way. More than half of expected disaster losses in the United States will not be covered by insurance. And that's a shame, because there is no more important disaster recovery tool than insurance. Now, this, of course, includes the National Flood Insurance Program, a program that I'm responsible for. And I mentioned that only 3% of North Carolinians have flood insurance, so we have a long way to go, no doubt. And nationwide, only a third of those in those highest flood risk zones, in the special flood hazard areas, only a third of them have flood insurance. So we have some goals, some objectives here, like doubling the number of insurance policies by 2022. Ambitious, but we believe achievable. And we want to work with you and all of our stakeholders to make sure that we can get out the word why they need to be insured. Now, to do so, I mentioned we have to not just talk to ourselves. It's great hearing the technical expertise here. It really is. But you need to spread that message far and wide beyond just ourselves. And for me, I've taken that to heart. Sure, I speak at emergency management conferences, but you know what I say to the emergency managers? I tell them to call their insurance agent. I tell them to tell their constituents to call their insurance agent. And I don't talk a lot about the emergency management aspect of my job because they know emergency management. Most of the innovation that comes from emergency management comes from those emergency managers on the ground at the local and the state level. But what I feel is lost on my community, on the emergency management community, is the value of financial preparedness, for example. And I can't tell you how many times I've had emergency managers come up to me and say, "Thank you so much for telling me that there is a state insurance commissioner in my state," because I reached out to them and we hadn't met before. And they are working cooperatively to close the insurance gap now in their states. Now, these external partnerships are crucial. The administrator just spoke last week to the National Association of Realtors. That might be an organization that's not always agreed with everything we've said, or at least not wanted to carry the torch on these issues. Why? Well, our interests haven't always been aligned. The interest of a realtor, if there's any in the room, no offense, your interest might be to your short-term interest to your client is to get the lowest monthly payment possible. And if you have to tack on flood insurance or earthquake insurance, that monthly payment goes up. That's less house maybe than that person could otherwise purchase. But what the administrator said to the realtors at their major conference just last week was, you are doing your clients a disservice. If you are not explaining to them that the risks they face, you will have to look those individuals that you sold a house to in the eyes after some of those pictures we saw today. He showed some of those pictures. He said, you'll have to look them in the eye and say, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you to get flood insurance. You really should have had it." Because frankly, it doesn't matter whether you're in the 1 in 100-year flood zone or not. Any home can flood. As we see over and over with all these disasters, the flooding occurs well outside the 1 in 100-year floodplain. Now, that's not something that FEMA can control. I cannot compel you to get flood insurance if you are either don't have a mortgage or live outside that special flood hazard area. But if you don't have flood insurance, you're putting yourselves and your families at risk. Now, we're thinking of innovative ways to draw attention to this. You heard some of the comments again from panelists earlier today, talking about the 1 in a 500 year. Well, in Hurricane Harvey, we were seeing losses, about 80% of the losses outside of the special flood hazard area. So yeah, 1 in 500 would be a good new target, but we saw flooding even beyond that, well outside the 1 in 500 year. So if you can help me carry the message that any home can flood and we can get the realtors on board. In fact, the realtors have now signed a memorandum of understanding with us, and they've committed to carrying this message forward. So we've come a long ways in just a short period of time. We need more partnerships like that. Now, of course, it's not just flood insurance, it's all types of insurance. 2 out of every 3 homes in America are underinsured. So sure, they have homeowners insurance, but it hasn't kept up with their lifestyle, or the insurance has not kept up with renovations they've done to their home. And the average, according to Nationwide Insurance, is around 22% underinsurance, with as high as 60% underinsured in some areas. Now, why is this important to a disaster survivor? Why is this important to the people that I am on the hook to care for after disaster? Well, let me give you an example. Hurricane Harvey, Harris County, Texas. I'm proud to say that FEMA has put an average of $4,000 in the hands of uninsured disaster survivors in Harris County, Texas, last year from Hurricane Harvey. I'm proud of that. That's $4,000 that an uninsured survivor would not otherwise have. But is that going to make them whole? It will not. And if they had, you ask, what if they had a flood insurance policy, since most of the damage there was due to flooding? Instead of receiving $4,000 from FEMA as an uninsured disaster survivor, they would have received, on average, $110,000 from NFIP. So ask yourselves, would you rather have $4,000 or $110,000 after a disaster? So to get this word out, we need to move on to objective number 1.3, because who are we preparing here? We're preparing the individuals. And we need to acknowledge that during a disaster, the emergency managers, and even the traditional first responders like the firefighters and police officers, paramedics, of which I'm a former firefighter paramedic, we are actually not the first responders. We are not the first responders after a catastrophic disaster. The individuals are. Why? Because a fire truck's not going to show up on the scene in 4 or 6 minutes after a catastrophic disaster. Individuals and families and communities might be on their own. Now, to prepare, we point everybody to ready.gov, and that's important. And we need to make sure that everybody knows how to turn off the water and gas to their homes, that they know to check on their neighbors. But we also need to make sure they have insurance, to my previous point. So we're very focused at FEMA for the first time in our history on financial preparedness. We've teamed with a non-governmental organization called Operation Hope to develop an emergency financial first aid kit. Again, bringing financial education and literacy to people before they become disaster survivors is a key goal of ours. And to do that, we can't do it on our own. FEMA is not a financial education and literacy organization. We're partnering with NGOs like Operation Hope, but also associations like the Association of Financial Counseling and Planning Education, with whom we will be signing an MOU next week, partnering with them on getting out the word on financial preparedness as a key part of what they do on financial literacy in education. Now, the reason that we focus on a culture of preparedness is to lessen future disaster impacts, to make a disaster survivor more resilient in the wake of a disaster. That's, of course, my focus, but we have a broader mission at FEMA, the more well-known mission of responding to disasters. And that's where goal number 2 comes in. Goal number 2 is preparing for a catastrophic disaster. And it's exactly what it sounds like, which is FEMA will be prepared, and FEMA will help our state and local partners be prepared for these truly catastrophic disasters. But for lesser disasters, those disasters that are not truly catastrophic, we need our state and local partners to step up and lead on those disasters so FEMA can be there and support them during the truly catastrophic ones. About 80% of disasters are under $41 million in the United States. We believe that that's a reasonable threshold to have as a goal for our state partners. So our state partners could lead the disaster response mission and be prepared to support that disaster response mission for a, quote, smaller disaster. I realize that it doesn't sound, no disaster is small. But what I'm talking about here is those really large disasters, like the 5 we've seen in the last 14 months. Thus, we are saying FEMA will be in the position of supporting those state and local governments in federally supported, state-managed, and locally executed disasters. Let me say that again. Federally supported, state-managed, locally executed. And that, we believe, is the right fit for FEMA. Now, speaking of fits, we have a FEMA integration team, something you may not have heard of before. Like that transition? The FEMA integration team is for the first time putting FEMA personnel, federal personnel, in the states to build their capabilities for catastrophic disasters. Now, many states are prepared to handle those smaller disasters, but not even the biggest states can't handle the catastrophic ones. And sometimes a state will come to us and say, if only we had X, we could actually manage those smaller disasters, and FEMA could focus on the bigger ones. And so we were sick of hearing that, so we said, all right, we're going to help you fill that void. So one of the most common things we'll hear is logistics. Many states don't have logistics contracts or the logistics wherewithal to do what they need to do in a catastrophic disaster. So we are deploying logistics experts to many states around the country. We started in North Carolina last year, or earlier this year. Good thing we did. They were there for Hurricane Florence. Those experts from FEMA are down there helping build up the capabilities of North Carolina before a disaster so that they're better able to respond after. Eventually, those federal employees will come home and those states are left with a higher level of capability, a knowledge base that will benefit all of us, that will ensure the state is best prepared for those disasters in the future. And finally, number 3, this is the crowd pleaser. This is what I mentioned, reducing the complexity of FEMA programs. We are taking that on. We're taking it very seriously, whether it be reducing the complexity of our flood program. I know as a recent home purchaser, it's not always easy to understand how to get your flood policy, even if you know that you need it. We want to increase we want to simplify our forms. We want to make them. We want to make it easier for every individual homeowner to understand our programs, whether it be flood insurance. We want renters to understand programs available to them, and we want everyone to be able to understand that we are working hard to reduce our internal complexity, like the fact that we have 10 IT systems dedicated to grants management. We've embarked on a multi-billion-dollar effort to consolidate those 10 systems to one. And let me tell you, if you want to get a headache, I will explain federal IT procurement to you. Multi-billion-dollar, multi-year effort to reduce 10 systems to one, and that's just to manage our grants. And finally, I'll say that we're looking to innovate. We're looking to streamline the inspection. We've streamlined the inspection process in many ways. Let me give you an example. We did a pilot in Hurricane Harvey in Austin, Texas. Actually, again, I said most innovation happens on the ground. So true at FEMA. Some of our employees on the ground in Hurricane Harvey said, you know what? It doesn't make sense for us to be doing all these inspections separately. So let's do them together. Let's do a damage portfolio to assess how best to direct our resources. Thus far, the pilot's been a huge success. It's reduced damage inspections by 66% and saved $14 million just in that case. We inspected 29,000 structures damaged by Hurricane Harvey instead of 80,000. And we reduced the number of total project completion time from 123 workdays to 51 workdays. We're encouraged by the results of that pilot, and we hope to roll that out broader in the future. Again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a few of my thoughts with you today. I'm delighted to be at Flash for the first time. I hope this will be the first of many times I get to join you. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.